Mirrors by Greensearcher. Chapter 25. Cersei stared into the long mirror, rubbing her nails against the cold glass. A crisp image reflected from its surface. Prince Adam sitting in the tower of her ancient fortress, head bowed and staring at his feet, waiting for her next command, exactly as he should be. She frowned, though she wasn't sure why. She sent another silent command to the mirror, checking on the rest of her prisoners, on the surrounding countryside. Everyone, everything exactly as it should be. Almost too exactly. She turned, looking back at that wretched servant Lumiere. He was currently encased by one of her spells. She couldn't harm him, it seemed, but she could at least detain him. He didn't seem the least bit perturbed, however, lounging lazily on the couch in the corner of the room, the invisible wall that surrounded him glimmering faintly, while he examined one of the buttons on his sleeve. She scowled, turning back to the tall mirror before her, which continued to scan the pleasant, undisturbed villages nearby. She frowned deeper. I need to check on things myself, she decided. She sucked in a breath, exhausted, forcing a spell onto its surface that would let her travel to the location shown. Lifting a hand, she made to pass through, but the glass remained solid. She paused for a moment, confused, feeling the magic seep from her fingertips, yet making no difference. She tried again, lifting the other hand, pressing against the cool glass with all her might. With a loud crack, the surface shattered. Cersei breathed shallowly, staring at the spindle-like fissures in the glass, radiating out from each palm. I can't leave, she thought, shocked. She turned again, looking back at the servant in the shadows. Lumiere watched her now, a bemused expression on his face. A new feeling was creeping into her chest, one she hadn't felt in a very long time. The feeling was fear. That servant, he had known about her past. But how? The only person who knew her truth was... Her eyes grew wide, and she stepped back slowly. She escaped, she realized, a sick feeling in her stomach. That old hag! She's escaped! She cursed aloud. How could she have forgotten something so important? Had that fool of a prince really managed to set Agatha free? You're the fool, Cersei thought, now trembling. You placed her right in his hands! Cersei brought her own hands to her head, mind foggy and dark. How long had it been so muddled? Why couldn't she simply think straight? Biting back a scream, she ran from the room. These halls were grand and large, decorated with the disgusting luxuries of men who built themselves up on the blood of those beneath them. The carpet beneath her feet coated in the blood of those she had taken for herself. Cersei glared at the hall's fine adornments as she ran, mind blind with hatred. Ploughing ahead, she didn't notice the way everything she had laid on her eyes on crumbled and darkened in her wake. Soon she slowed, the old body she now encased growing tired far more quickly. She didn't know where she was, only that this hall was quiet and dark, staring at her from the shadows. Portraits, filled with the kinds of people she hated most in this world. She hissed at them, racing forward again, anxious to escape their stares and find more of Victor's men to appease her growing appetite. Yet the damned paintings never seemed to end, and for all her efforts, she found herself at a dead end. Here, the largest portrait of them all loomed overhead. 3 figures painted across the grand canvas in colours that hadn't yet dimmed with time. They made her feel small, and she'd been about to turn away when the eyes from its frame caught her own. 2 pairs of blue, 1 brown. The latter belonged to a man with golden hair and a warm expression, hand resting on the shoulder of the blue-eyed woman beside him. In her lap, a son who grinned happily and shared her eyes. Eyes Cersei knew far too well. The rage built in her chest, bristling. She threw up her arms and sunk her nails into the canvas, a violent scream in her ears. Was it her own? She tore through the painting with a swift motion, shredding the beautiful faces. A sob. Was she crying? When the deed was done, she stepped back, vision watery, trying to feel satisfied, yet only feeling greater rage. And even through the ragged canvas, Prince Adam's bright eyes found her from the darkness. Why did you do that? Circe's heart stopped. Then, slowly she turned, searching the darkness for the voice. It spoke again, soft and youthful. Why did you tear them apart? She finally found its source. A child, standing in the reflection of an old window, connecting to the small dark cemetery far below. A girl, wearing rags, watching her with furrowed brows. It's just a painting, Circe whispered, that new fear returning again, unsure of what to make of this strange vision. I'm not talking about that. Circe looked away, back at the painting she had destroyed, a new tightness in her chest. They ruined my life, she said bitterly. How? Asked the child in innocence. Circe wrinkled her nose, whipping her head back and glaring at the strange girl. Because of him, She trailed off, growing frustrated, clenching weak fists at her side. I don't have to answer to you, spirit. The girl only frowned. You can't even answer yourself? Circe froze. Then, slowly, she took a step closer to the window. From here, she saw the girl's blonde, matted hair, her clouded eyes, the way she held a small, juvenile rose between the tips of her fingers with care. Those blind eyes now grew wide and desperate, frightened. What have I become? The child whispered. Circe watched her start to back away. Wait, she said, hollowly, reaching out an old, bony fingers and resting them on the glass's surface. The young Circe only shook her head. You took him from his family, she stammered. The little prince, just like we were taken from ours. You're worse than him. You're worse than Papa. No. The child's eyes were filled with tears now, wrinkling at the edges. It's true. You really are a monster. No! The girl vanished, body dissolving into nothingness, and the reflection in the glass returning to her own. Hideous, old, dying. Skin sagging, falling from her cheeks, eyes red and bleeding. Circe stared, gasping for breath, her body quaking. She reached for her stores, sent everything she had left to change back. Her skin glowed, beginning to heal, then faded again, falling away and looking worse than before. No, she thought, panic swelling in her breast. Why won't it work? She had taken more men in the last fortnight than all these years combined. Why was her magic draining so quickly? She turned, leaning her hunched back against the windows, fighting the quaking of her legs and the throbbing in her heart. Her vision swam, fading to a memory. Dark magic always bears a mark, Circe. You must stop this, or it will consume you. And, finally, a small part of her mind began to make sense of it all. Began to see herself for what she was. Oh God, she thought, gasping for breath. Old, quaking body where she stood. I really am a monster. Shouts of alarm rang through the busy square. 100 villagers running back and forth with arms full of supplies. Children and their caretakers, ones too weak or too old to fight, were being packed into every available wagon, the remaining gathering swords and torches in preparation. At Commander Giles's order, The attack was to take place that night, a week sooner than planned. A week that they'd planned to evacuate those most vulnerable in case things went wrong. Now they had but hours to get them away. Henry lifted his son into the closest wagon, setting him beside his grandmother. Mrs. Potts wrapped an arm around him, squeezing him tight. A young girl sat on Jack's other side, trembling and tugging her cloak further around her. 2 young women with blonde curls sat beside her, whispering frantically to themselves. "Jack?" the girl whispered. He turned to her. "Yeah?" "I'm scared," she admitted, squeezing her eyes shut. "Hold my hand." Jack looked surprised, but quickly recovered. "It's okay, Nicolette," he said bravely, squeezing her small fingers. "My papa's in charge, and he'll make sure we win." Jack looked back at his father then, hopeful. Henry gave him a wink, ruffling his hair, before stepping back out of the wagon and moving towards the front. Sophie was securing 2 large horses to the wagon. He rested a hand on her shoulder, and she looked back quickly. Her face was full of fear. "Henry!" He gathered her small frame in his arms, and she buried herself against him. It's just happening so fast," she whispered. What if—" "I'll be back for you," he promised, holding her tight. "Nothing's gonna stop me, 'cause I got something important to do later. If you agree." He pulled back, reaching a trembling hand for her own. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small pouch, and, swallowing, placed it in her palm. Sophie stared at him in shock, unaware of the growing chaos around them as a dozen men on horses trotted by. Then she quickly undid the cinch, pulling out the small object inside. A golden ring, hand-forged and carved with small, delicate designs. It had taken Henry several tedious attempts to get it right, but it was more than worth it for her. "Oh, Henry!" Sophie gasped, resting a hand over her heart. "I was gonna give it to you in a nicer way," he said nervously, "but since we're marching on the castle tonight, well, I couldn't go without asking first." Several dozen more men marched past, the skies quickly growing dark. Henry glanced at them, heart racing, then looked back at her. She stared at him with those large, dark eyes, gripping the ring in her palm. He sucked in a breath, leaning close. "Marry me, Soph?" His whisper was barely audible over the shouts all around. He swallowed again, and before she could reply, more words tumbled out. You're wonderful, and you've made me happy again, when I never thought I would be, and damn, I didn't get a chance to practice this, but I love you, and I—" She was up on her toes, lips connecting quickly with his. An urgent kiss, one that soon settled into something deeper. "That's a yes," she said, pulling away, eyes wrinkled at the corners and bright with joy. He blinked, then smiled wide, burying his fingers in her curls and kissing her again with passion. "Oi, Henry, not fooling around!" Someone called out. "We gotta go!" Henry kissed her for a moment longer and pulled back reluctantly. He then reached down quickly, slipping the small band over her ring finger. The gold looked perfect against her warm brown fingers, and he gripped them in earnest, chest warm and swelling with happiness. "Stay safe," she whispered. "And you." He glanced back towards those waiting in the wagon, towards his young son and the woman who had raised him. "And—" "I'll keep them safe too," Sophie promised. He helped her into the driver's seat, watching with a heart somehow light and heavy all at once, as she urged the horses into a run down the road. Dozen more wagons followed, carrying all they loved towards safety. Turning, Henry sucked in a breath and faced those that remained. A young man brought him a horse, the large black stallion that was Jack's. The boy had insisted his father take him today. "All right, Maggie," Henry said, mounting with a leap of energy and settling into the saddle. "You ready?" The horse huffed, pouring a hoof against the old cobblestone road. Giving him a gentle kick, Henry moved towards the front of the crowd that waited for him. He looked them over. They had come from across the countryside, hundreds of them, a fire in their eyes far brighter than the torches held aloft in the young night air. It was a sight Henry had yearned for years ago, back when he had been the only one brave enough to venture into those dark woods. The only one who dared to go against Victor's orders to stay away. And now, finally, others had come to his aid. Not to rescue a son this time, but to make sure that son stayed safe. To make sure every son and daughter in their kingdom stayed safe. A group of familiar faces stood near the front of the crowd, mounting atop their own steeds. That gang of men from Beaumont. Once lazy and indolent, they now waited in earnest for his orders. No longer taunting him for his stubborn loyalty, but joining him. The man, Emile, at the time the worst of them all, now nodded at him with a fierce determination in his eyes. Henry sucked in a breath. "Grab your torch!" he cried. The crowd thrust forth 100 hands, bearing 100 fires. "Aye!" they shouted together. "Mount your horse!" Henry bellowed, urging his own across the front line. "Aye!" Hundreds of sharp horse hooves padded along the road. "Victor has wreaked havoc on our village!" Henry bellowed, voice carried in the wind, heart wild with conviction. "Too long! We've let him wander free!" The cheers erupted again, ear-splitting this time. Energy swelled through the crowd, dense and palpable. Henry stopped Maggie, turning him towards the road ahead. "It's time to take some action, boys," he rasped. "Finally, time." Adam stood, waiting while the mirror he had once kept in his room grew tall enough to reflect his entire frame, and wide enough to include his father and mother to his left, and Belle to his right. Their images soon disappeared, revealing every citizen they'd recruited over the past weeks, a massive force of torches and swords and shouts. Agatha pulled back her hand, turning to them and giving them a wink. "They can't see me?" Alexander asked her. "They can," she nodded, stepping away. Adam's father stepped forward and spoke to the crowd through the glowing mirror. His voice was strong and confident, and soon had the men beyond cheering with gusto. Adam gripped the small parchment in his hand tighter, waiting for his turn. His father stepped back too soon, and, swallowing, Adam took his place. He stared at the crowds. They seemed so close, though he knew them to be miles off. So close, and so anxious to hear his words. And, after a moment, he tossed the parchment aside. The scripted words had served him well in his speeches across the countryside, but they seemed far too formal for this moment. "No doubt you see me as a stranger," he started. He swallowed, glancing at his feet. "And, I admit, I still know little of you. For a decade I could do nothing. Nothing but fear for you. Nothing but watch and know I could do nothing to help." The crowd grew still, their rustling energy from before dissolving into a thoughtful silence. Sucking in a breath, Adam looked up. "Yet, while I was imprisoned, I never forgot you," he said firmly. "So, if we are strangers now, I hope we can be friends. For you are my own, and I am a part of you." For a heartbeat, his people remained quiet. Then, in an instant, cheers, building and sweeping over the massive crowd. "There's a fire in my heart," Adam proclaimed, gaining confidence. "As long as I can do something, I will. He paused, heart pounding. "I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." As the cheers swelled, Adam turned back to Belle, reaching for her hand and guiding her to his side. "I don't believe fame or nobility are required for greatness," he said, watching her for a moment, before turning back to his audience. "I see greatness in each of you. I saw it in the woman who saved me from a 10-year prison. She came from among you, and is the reason I stand before you today. She is the reason we have a chance." Their cries of support grew in volume, and Belle flushed. "Tell them," Adam whispered, leaning close and squeezing her hand.
You can do this.
She nodded nervously, sucking in a breath of her own, and stepping forward. I'm honoured to be here, she said, gaining her voice, and I just want to say, you are all my friends. At the word, something shifted in the image before them. A wave of golden light, it seemed, passed over the vast crowds. The effect of Belle's statement, a shield for their supporters from any harm Cersei might wish them. Belle noticed it too and relaxed. So, have courage, my friends, she went on, her own sureness having grown at the declaration's success. We will meet again, in a free kingdom! The cheers grew into a cacophony of hoots, of applause, and heavy stomping against the earth. Agatha touched the mirror again, and the image returned to their own, their cheers fading into silence. Sighing, Adam turned to Belle. She smiled at him. They're safe from her now, she said. Let's go. Victor groaned. He opened his eyes, squinting even in the dim light, the ceiling above him spinning. Too much wine, he grumbled to himself, rolling to his side and hoisting himself to his knees. He sucked in a rough breath and looked up. Bodies. The room filled with them. Those of his highest-ranking men, their blood half dried against the rug. He scrambled back, gasping, eyes searching the room in panic. God! He barked in fear, voice high and frightened. Nothing but the sound of a distant shout replied, and no one came. Shaking, he forced himself to his feet, cringing at the scent of death that filled the room. He swallowed, trying to rack his mind for what had happened here. What couldn't he remember? Why had he been spared? He shook his head. Why did it matter? At least he had been spared. He stepped around the bodies of his men, plugging his nose at the sight of them. What a mess. King Victor! He turned, watching a junior officer stumble into the room. The boy's eyes grew wide at the sight, stopping mid-thought before shaking his head and going on. The castle is under attack!
Obviously,
Victor snapped, motioning at the dead men all around him.
Where are my guards?
There! The distant shouts grew louder. Angry, chaotic, leaking in from the room's grand balcony. Victor frowned, moving towards the noise, fumbling with the lock and shoving open the grand glass doors. He moved to the balcony's ledge, staring down at the gates far below, the forest just beyond. Small fires spotted the trees, shadows swelling across the path, attached to those violent cries, to the sounds of heavy hooves and angry men.
Who dares?
He breathed darkly. A mob, Your Majesty, the man stammered from behind him. Men from the local villages. Victor huffed.
I know that,
he said. God, this boy was dense. The soldier seemed too frightened to even react to his king's irritation. Instead, his eyes wandered across the bodies on the ground, then out towards the trees. What should we do?
Ask your commander, Lieutenant,
Victor barked. The soldier was quiet for a long moment. I'm the highest-ranking man left, my king. Victor froze, finally turning back to face him.
What?
He breathed in disbelief.
He bristled in irritation. That's preposterous. I brought a full battalion here. Where are they?
Immobilized, my lord, the young lieutenant replied quietly. Or dead. 'Tis a demon lurking in these halls, Your Majesty. And suddenly, a faint memory flashed in Victor's mind. A beautiful woman, bright scarlet eyes, a hand on his throat, a delicious yet excruciating kiss. Beads of sweat formed on his brow.
I have to get out of here.
He looked back at the soldier, still awaiting his command.
Well, take the rest of the men and fight them off, he ordered.
The lieutenant paled. But Your Majesty, he said, they outnumber us. I don't think we can.
You will lie down and defend your king,
Victor snarled, moving towards him in fury. He was taller than the young man, and the boy cowered beneath him as he gripped his vest with a rough hand.
Either you do so, he said darkly, or I'll have your head and the heads of everyone you love. Do you hear me?
The boy's eyes grew wide in fear, but he nodded, and without another word, he escaped back down the hall. Victor watched him go. No doubt he was sending the man to his death. Though, of course, he didn't care. He just needed enough time to get away from this place. Someone cleared their throat. Victor started, turning to see a figure in the shadows. "Ah, it seems I am free again," they said. That servant, Lumiere, stood from where he sat, stretching and sauntering towards Victor with a lazy stride. Victor frowned at him. Lumiere leaned against the large bookcase against the far wall, examining a nail. "It's a shame there's no way to escape from this room," he said casually. "That would be quite convenient, no?" Victor blinked. He recalled his youth, of tunnels and secret passages, hidden in the depths of the earth. His eyes flashed to the bookcase again, and he grinned.
"Bring a light," he ordered Lumiere. "We are leaving." "You sure King Alexander's all right with us? You know, bang! Breaking down his front door?" "Yep,"
Henry told the man, his companion, as they and a dozen others rammed the heavy tree trunk against the front doors of the palace. "Bang!"
"All part of the plan," Henry assured him.
One more hit and the doors came crashing down. His men flooded inside, shouting fiercely and sliding their weapons from their belts. They were playing the part of an angry mob quite well, though Henry sensed most of it wasn't an act at all. The entryway was pitch black. Strange, since the castle was supposedly occupied. They moved slowly into the darkness, torches held high. Their boots rang loudly off the marble floor, echoing against the ceilings high above.
"So stop!"
Henry turned, his men already surrounding the source of the shout. He pushed his way through quickly, a young lieutenant in the centre and no more than half a dozen troops' worth of men cowering behind him. The leading soldier held a spear aloft, its tip shaking. He swallowed, but went on. "But by the order of King Victor, we demand you stand down." A number of Henry's men laughed at that. They had the poor chap surrounded 3-1 after all.
"Look, we don't want to hurt you," Henry started. "King Alexander is willing to work with those who wish to join us."
The young lieutenant blinked, his spear growing loose in his palms.
"King Alexander?" "Aye," Henry nodded. "He led us here himself. What do you say then?"
The soldiers looked nervous, glancing behind him at those who they led. Most were young, like him, or else very old. And by the looks on their faces, these seemed to be some of the least loyal of Victor's soldiers.
"Our families," a rough voice said.
An older soldier stepped past the young lieutenant and planted his own spear into the ground.
"Victor threatened them," he said gruffly. "A slew of soldiers deserted within Victor's first year of power, so he slaughtered their families to convince the rest of us to stay."
Several of Henry's men cursed, lowering their own weapons. Henry tucked his own sword back into his belt.
"They'll be safe," he promised. "By dawn, Victor will be in custody, and the true king on the throne once again."
The man narrowed his eyes, yet after a moment he nodded. The rest of those behind him relaxed, and Henry even caught a few smiles painted on their faces.
"Where are the rest of your men?"
Henry asked. This is all of us," the young lieutenant replied, looking a bit abashed.
"He's lying!" someone in the mob barked. "There's gotta be more of them!"
Henry furrowed his brows. With so few soldiers left, it would make little sense to split up. He sensed the man was telling the truth. Yet, at the thought, he finally heard what they had been searching for before. Footfalls, hundreds of them, thundering from the halls above. "The demons!" one of Victor's soldiers cried. Many more of them cried out, some gripping their weapons once again while others crouched in fear. Henry frowned. There should be only one enchantress lurking in these halls, not a full, heavy-footed troop's worth. He looked up towards the balcony. and he saw them. Enormous beings in the shadows, marching in an unnatural, uniform pattern.
Who are they?
Emil whispered from behind him.
Dunno,
Henry said. He gripped his sword once again.
But it looks like our king still needs us.
The old passage was damp, cold, and much longer than he remembered. Victor stopped, leaning against one stone wall, trying to catch his breath. Damn, but he hadn't walked so far in 10 years. Do you need a moment, my lord? Lumia asked. His voice hinted at amusement. No doubt an arduous quarter-hour of walking is taking a toll on your knees.
Victor scowled. Do not mock me, servant. I could send you back to face the mob if I wished.
Oh, a threat? Lumia said, raising a brow. To the only one left to protect your fat ass.
Victor bristled, turning back to face him. Why, you smug son of a bitch!
He growled. He stopped, still short of breath, face growing red with anger.
I'll have your head for this! You worthless bastard!
New light entered the narrow tunnel. Victor stopped short, watching as several shadows grew along the wall.
Who's there?
Victor asked, pushing back from the wall and staring at the approaching figures in fear.
Who are you?
The closest figure moved forward into the light of Lumiere's candelabra. He walked with a slight limp, a cane in one hand, his form leaner than Victor remembered. Yet he still recognized him with a perfect, terrifying clarity.
Hello, brother,
the man said quietly. Victor stared at him, mouth growing dry. It couldn't be. The man nodded, more men emerging from behind him. Stumbling back, Victor pushed Lumiere aside and scrambled back the way they had come. He was overtaken quickly, however, rough hands grabbing him and forcing him to his knees.
Oh, Victor,
the man said with a limp, approaching slowly and cocking his head.
You might be a scoundrel, but at least you're a predictable one. Alexander?
Victor finally managed.
You're supposed to be dead. Yes, I suppose I am.
Alexander shrugged, leaning on his cane and looking him over.
Good Lord, you certainly let yourself go.
Shut up! Victor snapped, but stopped as more men emerged from the darkness, standing behind Alexander. A smaller figure moved to his side, blue eyes bright in the shadows.
Jacqueline? Victor stammered. No, this isn't real. You are nothing but ghosts. Spirits come to torment me.
I assure you, we are quite real, the Queen said plainly. She narrowed her eyes. Though we have no opposition to providing the requisite torment. Victor's heart hammered in his chest. He struggled against the men around him, but they only held him tighter, faces speckled with amusement. Beside him, Lumiere looked the most amused of it all, snickering quietly to himself.
Traitor!
Victor realized furiously. Alexander stepped forward.
Adam informed us of how you cared for him when we were gone,
he said casually. But that's not quite right, is it? Jacqueline said, touching his arm. She, too, seemed strangely amused.
Ah, you are right, my dear,
Alexander agreed. He turned back to his brother,
growing somber. You tried to murder him.
Victor gasped.
Adam's still alive?
He said in shock. Then, realizing his slip, he backtracked.
I mean that was just a misunderstanding, he said quickly. I was only joking with the boy. I'm sure.
Alexander stepped forward, fiddling with the blade's handle at his belt.
Now, what to do with you?
What was it that Locke proposed, my dear? Jacqueline asked, a wicked gleam in her eye. Did he not advocate that a true ruler abide by the will of his people?
Indeed,
Alexander agreed.
Perhaps we can let our people decide what to do with him.
He paused, staring down into Victor's eyes.
It was them you offended, no? Them you taxed? Them you imprisoned? He paused, eyes growing dark, leaning closer. Their daughters you stole and abused? Victor swallowed roughly.
Alexander narrowed his eyes.
I'm sure plenty of them would love to have a say in your punishment.
Victor grew pale as a sheet, eyes wide with horror.
Yes,
Alexander went on, pulling back. He nodded towards his men, and they dragged Victor to his feet.
That seems the best solution indeed.
The climb was steep here. An older tunnel, abandoned long ago after a collapse, but apparently restored during those months Adam had been lost in a jump through time. Beside him, Belle held a small map drawn in her own hand. Examining it in the dim light of her lantern held by Giles's elite force, assigned to accompany them. Adam stared at the detailed cartography, though his mind dwelled on his parents, wondering if they'd be successful in their own task, thinking back to their departure not an hour ago. Adam held the small woman tight.
Stay safe, Mamma,
he whispered. And you, my darling, she said. Oh, I wish we didn't have to part here.
Papa's in no shape to keep up with us.
Adam finally pulled back, looking over towards his father, who was conversing quietly with Giles. In truth, the king had grown so emaciated in his time in Cersei's dungeon that full control of one leg hadn't returned. Adam still wasn't used to seeing him with a limp. He looked back at his mother.
You're right to stay with him, he told her.
You don't have to face her, you know, Jacqueline went on, brushing a few strands of hair from his face that had fallen loose. You could come, stay with us instead. Let Agatha and Giles's men take her down alone. Adam frowned, looking at his feet for a moment.
I need to do this, Mamma,
he said at last.
I don't know why. I guess I just need...
Closure? She asked.
Perhaps.
Sighing, she nodded, letting him go as Alexander approached. He wrapped his free arm around his son, squeezing tight. Beside them, Belle finally pulled back from a long embrace with her own father.
Your mother was fearless,
Maurice told her, holding her shoulders and staring her straight in the eyes.
And so are you. She would be so proud.
Belle nodded, looking teary, and hugged him once more, before pulling back, looking towards the ground. Stay and protect Papa, all right, Max? The large grey mat gave a short bark, circling Maurice quickly before settling back on his haunches at attention. Maurice would be staying in the bunker tonight to maintain the pulley system elevator. At least that was the public reason. In truth, his fits wouldn't allow him to engage in any kind of direct combat. Adam embraced Maurice then, and his parents Belle, before the group split. Maurice to head back to the safety of the bunker, his parents and a group of soldiers to continue down the wide tunnel before them. Belle, Adam, Giles and Agatha, towards a second, smaller tunnel that forked off the main path and climbed sharply towards the surface below.
You young people sure are slow.
Adam looked up, broken from his thoughts. The voice was Agatha's, ringing from her mirror at Giles's belt.
It's steeper than it looks,
one of Giles's soldiers said in exasperation.
Might not be so hard if I get a ride up too, he grumbled.
Agatha just chuckled.
We've gone about 2,000 paces, Giles said, ignoring them. Belle?
Belle pulled out a small ruler from her pocket. Adam turned, crouching, and letting her place the map flat against his back to make a quick measurement. I believe we're nearly there then, she said. There should be a bend just ahead, then the stairs. True to her word, a set of old, crumbling steps soon appeared. The stairway was narrow, just wide enough to ascend single file, but they soon reached a wide platform at the top. A tall, square door sat in the wall, several feet off the ground, marking their destination. Adam approached it, placing a hand on its surface. Its metal was wood, old and rough. He brushed his fingers along the surface, finding a small lever near the side. He lifted it loose, and then pulled away, skin now stuck with splinters.
My prince,
Giles said quietly, stepping to his side.
When the time comes, I will complete the task. The task? Giles's eyes grew dark. A man who has killed is never the same, he said, even when done for a just cause. I will not have you stain your hands needlessly.
Adam blinked.
He stopped.
How had Giles known? Were his worries so obvious? It was then he realised his free hand was gripping the hilt of his sword yet again. Trembling, he pursed his lips, forcing his fingers to loosen.
Giles, you don't have to. It was not a request, my lord, Giles said firmly. Face her if you must, but I will put an end to that monster. It will not damage me as it would you.
Adam trailed off. For, in truth, Giles's offer was one he truly wished for. He nodded slowly.
All right.
And with that, he pushed against the passage exit. It stuck for a moment, then flew open at the force. What lay beyond was not at all what they had been expecting. Adam gazed into the dark hall, into what was supposed to be the far stretches of the West Wing. It had always been somewhat shadowy and abandoned, but now it looked completely foreign to him. The wallpaper was dirty, peeling along the edges in places, and barely clinging to the walls in others. Moth-eaten curtains shaded black-tinted window panes, revealing the rain that began to fall against the dark sky. Large cream pillars lining the hall were now grey and crumbling, threatening to topple over at any moment. And what had once been beautiful Romanesque statues on display were now hideous, snarling creatures. The only thing that hadn't changed were the large murals along the walls, but even the faces in these seemed far more menacing than before. Belle had stepped through the passage, stopping on the now blackened rug beneath their feet, and staring at the scene in shock. She looked back at Adam, then, eyes quaking. "What is this place?" she whispered. Behind them, the rest of Giles's unit followed through the secret passageway, which was, in fact, one of the large gallery frames, swung open by several hinges. The last man shut the private passage again, revealing a large family portrait behind. It was torn to shreds.
"She's losing control,"
Agatha said quietly. The mirror at Giles's belt shimmered for a moment, and the old enchantress appeared at their side in human form. She looked around at the space, frowning.
"She can no longer contain it." "Contain what?"
Adam asked, nervously.
"The darkness inside her."
They moved slowly through the passage. Soon the gazes from the portraits vanished, torn through by rough claws that had dug into their canvas surfaces and along the walls connecting each frame. A jagged line, weaving through the darkness. Broken only were a few chairs or a table separating them. The latter sat in pieces along the floor, nothing spared by whatever creature had unleashed its fury on these halls.
"My lord."
Giles started. He raised a hand, resting it on Adam's shoulder, and speaking quietly.
"I hate to ask, but you didn't?" "No," Adam said. "This wasn't me." Belle moved bravely alongside him, but Adam felt her hand tuck itself tight against his. He held back, heart racing in a strange, new fear. One he hadn't let himself feel until now. "Belle," he whispered, "maybe you should go back."
She shook her head quickly. "She can scare us all she wants," she said, "but she can't hurt us, remember?" They followed the distraction, out of the West Wing, and towards one of a dozen open landings that overlooked the Hall of Arms deep into the darkness below. Here, too, the place had grown dusty and dilapidated, as though abandoned for several decades, not just the months it had been. The soldiers followed them at either side, holding out flames that cast deep shadows along the walls. How strange it was to wander the halls of his own home in such a state of disrepair, abandoned without even a candle left to light their path. In truth, it didn't feel like home anymore. The shadows changed then, and the group froze. A dozen forms lay on the carpet, just ahead. Unmoving in the darkness, Belle gasped quietly at his side.
"Bodies,"
Adam realised, mouth growing dry.
"Don't look!"
he told her. One of their men stepped forward bravely, thrusting his lantern towards the scene before them. Not just bodies, but bodies sitting in blood, dried in long tendrils against the carpet, chests as empty as their eyes. Adam tried to swallow, failing. These men may have been Victor's men, but even the worst criminal would never have received such a punishment from his father.
"This is Cersei's work, all right,"
Agatha said, moving beside him.
"A desperate attempt to hold on to her power."
"It's just like she told me," Belle whispered, her eyes wide and round, clearly not having heeded Adam's warning. Belatedly, she squeezed them shut, burying her face against his sleeve.
"Consumed by the creature inside, he thrust his claws into her bosom and took the promised heart."
Adam recalled the story Giles had related to him, the one told to Belle in the storyteller's stolen form. This part had certainly proved true. Did that mean... Then, crouching in the darkness and the shadows, he feasted. Had their hearts really served such a purpose? Adam shuddered, reaching his arm around Belle's shoulders and trying to focus on the warmth of her frame instead of the cold eyes along the floor ahead of them. He should have been better prepared. He should have expected something like this.
"She can't hurt us,"
he reminded himself.
"She can't!"
A sharp gust of wind, cold like ice, dousing the torches all around and plunging them into darkness. Adam spun around, moving in front of Belle, hand snapping to his waist and ripping the weapon from his belt. He heard a dozen more swords coming free as Giles's men did the same. His eyes strained open, searching the darkness. A terrified shout from their ranks. A scuffle, the sound of a weapon surrendered to the floor, and a choking gasp. The men around them began to cry out in panic.
"Hold your positions!"
Giles barked. Adam felt Belle's fingers grip the back of his shirt, trembling. Or was he the one trembling? He couldn't tell. He moved his other hand to the blade to steady it. Something began to glow. Agatha, her hands returning light to the space. And where the light fell. Behind him, Belle gasped. A soldier, near the end of their party, was in the air, feet dangling, hanging by some invisible force. But as the light spread, it became clear that something held him there, its hunched form casting ragged shadows against the wall. The intruder made a sound. A snarl, bringing the man close to its large, cloaked face. But at the motion, a spark of light flew between them. The man was released, falling back to his feet, momentarily dazed before grabbing his sword once again and scrambling to his feet. The attacker had already moved on, weaving among their ranks, darting between the men so quickly that it was impossible to make out what was happening. The men shouted in alarm as long, clawed fingers shot towards throats and limbs, but each of the intruder's attempts resulted in yet another spark of light. It shrieked in fury with each failed attempt, its movements growing ever more wild and erratic. At last it broke free of them, moving deep into the hallway ahead. And, as suddenly as it appeared, it stopped, still as stone in the shadows. Rain had begun to fall outside, hammering against the roof above. A bolt of lightning filled the hall with a sudden, bluish light. The cloaked figure stood before them, now illuminated under the dancing shadows of rain. And, slowly, it turned its head back to face them. Beside him, Belle pressed a hand to her mouth. Adam only stared, breathless and unblinking.
"Good God!"
The figure breathed heavily, its large, arched back rising high in the air before falling again. Pale hair fell in snarled patches from beneath its hood, tearing through the cloak along its shoulders and back, dragging across the floor alongside its tattered robes. Its hands brushed the floor where it crouched, thick, dark nails scratching absently against the carpet. Fangs emerged from the hooded face, dripping with blood. Thunder roared,
the lightning faded, and 2 round, glowing orbs blinked open from the darkness. "Ah," Giles said, stepping forward and holding his sword to one side. He ducked his head, staring her straight on. "There you are, creature," she hissed, turning those terrifying eyes on the tiny old enchantress who stood near his side. They seemed to grow fearful at the sight. "Hello again, my apprentice," Agatha said evenly. Adam had never seen her look so solemn. The creature's breath grew heavy, and her eyes scanned the rest of them. They froze after a moment, latching onto Adam from the darkness. "You?" she asked, her voice deep and grating. Inhuman. Yet, at the same time, it quaked with an uncertainty Adam had never heard before. Adam stared at those eyes. No whites remained. Only enormous sockets of bright scarlet. He clenched his fists, ignoring how damp his palms had grown. "Cersei," he said flatly. The strange eyes grew wide, though instead of seeming surprised or angry that he had escaped from her spell and her prison, she seemed sorrowful. Adam frowned at the thought. "No, she doesn't know sorrow. Only hate." Cersei sucked in another breath, shallow and weak. She moved forward. She stopped short, for Giles had wasted no time in charging at her, with a speed a man his age shouldn't have possessed. His sword flew forward, aiming straight for her heart. From behind, Agatha cast forth both short arms, her fingers filled with light. But before either could strike, Cersei vanished. Giles swung anyway, hitting nothing but empty air. Stopping in place, he looked around in vain. "Find her!" he shouted back to his men. "Don't let her escape!" As soon as he said it, however, Cersei's voice echoed through the large empty halls, Adam straining his ears at the sound, not recognizing the words. "Prussian," Giles observed, frowning deeply and huffing in frustration. Agatha nodded beside him. "She calls for aid." Cersei's echoes faded into silence. And then, footfalls, heavy ones, thundering from floors high above them. Giles' shoulders surrounded Belle and Adam without prompting, facing spears and blades into the darkness towards whatever was coming. The stomping was unnaturally heavy, and seemed to come from all directions, until finally dozens of massive figures emerged from each end of the hall. "Ugh!" Adam groaned, shoulders drooping. "Not these guys again." Men as tall as the ceiling stood up before them. "Potsdam's giants," Adam recalled, the same Cersei had sent on him that fated night in the woods. It seemed an entire troop of them had filled the wide open halls, not only standing both before and behind them, but lining the floors above as well. Adam stared up at the giant men, frowning. He wasn't used to feeling so small. "Can they hurt us?" one of Giles's men asked nervously, his spear quaking slightly in his hands. "Not if they're under Cersei's power," Belle replied, though she pursed her lips as though not quite sure of her answer. Adam looked back at the enormous men. Like before, their eyes were blank and lifeless, each with a single rose tucked into his vest, though the flowers seemed slightly wilted now. Beside him, Agatha appeared oddly cheerful, beginning to roll up her sleeve. "Oh, ho, 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 this should be fun," she grinned. A loud clang, and Adam looked up, realizing someone was already engaging with them. Giles, having pulled a second blade from his belt, now fought off the closest dozen giants with the same calm demeanour he held during a friendly duel. Spears shot at him from their ranks, each one only barely missing them. Belle gasped. "Giles, be careful!" she cried. But the giants' weapons never struck flesh, only bouncing back in flashes of light. Giles had managed to disarm those he engaged, but more quickly filled their ranks. He frowned, pulling back, and watching curiously as the giants formed a fresh wall to block his way. "Damn! he huffed, wiping his sleeve against his brow. It's true they can't hurt us, but they can still block our way. We'll have to... Now, hold on, Agatha said, stepping forward and waving him aside. Let me have a crack at 'em. Her hands began to glow bright, and in a moment she cast them forward. A sharp gust of wind flew through the lines of men, ruffling their coats and hair. Yet it died down quickly, and they remained as fixed in place as before. Agatha blinked, then pouted, saying something under her breath in a tongue Adam had never heard before, though from the sound of it, he was fairly certain it was a curse. I've forgotten my own teachings, she admitted, turning back to them and raising a finger. Once a spell is cast, it cannot be interfered with. We fight through then, Giles directed, unfazed. He turned to his men. They hold no threat to you, but reserve your strength. This will be no short-lived task. As the soldiers pulled forth their weapons, Adam sensed Belle shift beside him. Wait! She said, and the others paused in their ranks. Circe's spell uses the roses, doesn't it? She wondered. If we can just get rid of them, won't that stop it? Ah, Agatha said, tapping the end of her nose. The best answer is often the simplest. Yes, I believe that may be easily done. We still may have to fight them to do so, Giles said. I don't think they'll let us pluck their roses away so easily. Adam's mind had drifted. He saw a glowing rose, sitting in the air beneath the shield of glass, living for years before finally starting to decay. He remembered staring at it at times, watching the small beads of dew forming against its petals. He blinked, turning back towards those now moving in a formation against the giants. They need water, he gasped. The others turned back to him, confused. The roses! They must be taking water from the air, he went on, but stopped quickly. But I don't know what we could do about that. Oh, these children are wise, Agatha said. She raised her hands again and grinned. There is indeed something we can do about that. She closed her eyes, and everyone waited. Nothing seemed to happen at first. But then... Adam's throat grew dry in an instant. He struggled to swallow, the air suddenly devoid of the moisture it had once held. And then he noticed it. Damp beneath his boots. Small pools of water forming across the carpet from the water that had only moments before been hovering invisible in the air. Agatha lowered her arms, and Adam looked up at the giants once again. Their roses had lost their bright colour, sagging against their chests, petals shriveled in place. And the life that had been once filled the flowers now took root in the eyes of the small army of men. Stand down, Giles told his men, holding a hand to stop their approach. These men are our allies, and took much bloodshed to make it so. We will speak with them. I will speak with them. He moved forward before the tallest of the group then, who wore several bright pendants indicating his high rank. Giles spoke in the man's foreign tongue, standing tall and calm as he no doubt attempted to explain the situation. The Prussian commander looked bewildered for several long moments, but was soon nodding slowly as Giles explained. The men around them were mumbling, restless, yet word was soon travelling through their ranks. Adam sighed. Good, he thought. Now we can... A shout, and the crowd of men shifted as an older soldier pushed his way forward. He broke through, pointing an angry finger at Giles, face beet red and eyes wild with fury. What's he saying? Belle whispered anxiously. Giles had his hand raised before him, speaking carefully and no doubt trying to talk the man down. The others around started to frown, staring at Giles with sudden distrust. Agatha, Belle went on, what's going on? The man who had stepped forward had pulled a musket from his shoulders, swinging up and thrusting the sharp bayonet right where Giles stood. Belle's scream hung in the air, along with the cries of their men. Yet just before the weapon struck, it froze in place, and the man who held it had vanished. Agatha was scowling, dropping her hands and sighing as she finished the spell. The long musket fell to the floor, rolling back and forth as though possessed. Indeed, it now held the man who had tried to attack their commander. The remaining giant men stared at the trembling weapon,
eyes growing wide. Their leader now pulled his own weapon from his back, pointing it forward and shouting fearfully. Giles was speaking frantically now, backing away slowly as he did. The foreign soldiers only grew more and more restless, their own shouts filling the hall as a wave of weapons were loosed and they began closing in on them from all sides of the hall. Giles cursed, drawing his own weapons again, and turning back to the rest of the men.
"He recognised me. From the war, over 40 years ago. Apparently my unit killed his brother."
He turned back to face the angry men, huffing in frustration.
"It seems we will be fighting them after all," he went on, "and now they can hurt us."
In an instant, chaos. Giles's men encircled Adam and Belle once again, forming a wall of protection as dozens of men the height of the ceilings charged at them. The first wave of them vanished, one by one, sucked inside guns and spears and jackets, falling to the ground at their feet. Agatha was only getting started, it seemed. Yet the spell only seemed to incite the rest of them further, and a wave of twice as many charged forward. Agatha couldn't stop them all at once, however, and soon Giles's soldiers were forced to engage with them. They took the giants on 2 at a time, shouting, jabbing, darting sideways to avoid the jagged bayonets that threatened to sink into their flesh. Belle gasped. Adam spun around, pulling her behind him, barely raising his sword in time to stop the heavy musket threatening to cut them down. The man had broken through their ranks, eyes wild as he pulled back to strike again. Adam reacted faster, burying his own blade in the man's bicep. He screamed in pain, and Adam yanked his weapon away, watching in triumph as the man hobbled backwards and grasping his arm. "Adam!" He turned back, barely reacting in time as another musket barreled down towards them. This man was even larger and stronger than the last, and Adam's arm shook as he tried to push back. But the man too cried out, pulling away. Confused, Adam looked over. A large gash stood bright against the soldier's thigh, and he soon stumbled to his knees. Beside him, Belle's shorter blade shone with the same bright red as she gripped it between her hands. She breathed heavily, looking back up at Adam with wide eyes. He blinked in shock.
"Thanks!"
Belle gasped again, looking past him. Adam barely registered the presence of another man towering over him when Belle stepped forward, and before he could even react, she had pulled a fist against her opposite shoulder before throwing with all her might and elbow straight towards the place that holded the man's family jewels. The giant soldier stopped mid-motion, sword frozen in place above his head. Gasping, his face grew pale and racked with agony. The sword slipped from his hands, which flew immediately to the space between his legs. He fell promptly to his knees, then the floor, twitching. Belle watched him, blinking slowly, as if shocked she had actually managed to reduce a man into such a state. Then she looked back up at Adam, eyes alight with victory. Adam grinned at her. He opened his mouth to speak again, but a new sound filled his ears. The click of a musket. Time seemed to stop as he looked up slowly. One of the giant soldiers held his weapon, loaded, slowly lowering it until the barrel was aimed straight for them.
"No!"
His fingers were already at the trigger. Adam's heart beat once, his arms heavy as they tried to push Belle away. A click and a boom. Adam grimaced, but no pain came. He opened his eyes. A figure stood before them, blood now pooling at the back of his coat where he had taken the bullet. He stood tall in the shadows, gold glimmering from each ear. Then, slowly, he dropped the 2 swords in his hands and fell to his knees.
"No!"
One of their own soldiers quickly cut down the gun-bearer, staring over in shock at his commander, fell to his knees onto the floor. Belle had rushed forward, crying out in anguish, trying desperately to roll the injured man over. Adam's feet moved off their own, his mind a blur as he helped her pull the man over into his lap. He knew who it was, but seeing his face made it all the worse. And finally he found his voice. "No!"
"You know, sir, I think your talents are being wasted here."
Giles ignored the man, not slowing his pace through the war-beaten camp. It had been 5 years. 5 years of fighting. 5 years without him. The fighting had ended, but he had yet to see an end to the loneliness. Giles stopped at the camp's edge then, where the ground dropped off sharply and overlooked the valley below. He stared ahead, seeing no beauty in the land beneath him. His eyes had lost a bit of their bright, youthful vibrancy, the once bright green, now a lifeless grey.
"He wouldn't want you to be like this,"
he sighed, looking back to the man who had spoken before. The recruiter was flat-footed, about his age, but obviously unsuited for battle, and had just barely managed to catch up to this moment. He sucked in a couple of breaths, hands resting on his knees briefly before continuing on.
Yes, we could use someone like you commanding the Royal Guard,"
he said, wiping the sweat from his brow, and straightening again. He pulled a small watch from his vest, checking the time absently before pocketing it again. Giles sighed, finally turning to face the man.
"Who will protect these people?"
he asked seriously. He looked back over the valley, where they stood. It showed the signs of their struggle. Half-constructed war camps, fields trampled under troops of heavy boots. Yet it also showed life, speckled with newly built homes where residents could finally live in peace.
"I sacrificed everything for them,"
Giles went on, heart burning in his chest.
"Everything." "You will protect our king," the man offered, raising a finger, "and he protects them all."
Giles frowned, but remained silent.
"Perhaps a visit," the man prodded, "to see what life at the palace is like." "Perhaps."
Another month, and he found himself deep in the northern woods, staring up at the towering turrets and amid large, lush garden. The recruiter had come forward for him was called himself Cogsworth, and stood with him now. "Yes, a spectacular fortress, is it not?" he asked eagerly. Giles hummed. It was spectacular, no doubt, but its splendour could not convince him those who dwelled within were worth protecting. Footsteps on the cobblestone. Giles turned, seeing a tall man in elaborate robes sweeping past the rose-bushes. Beside him, Cogsworth's demeanour changed instantly. Where high-spiritedness once dwelled, now rested fear. He appeared to be forcing himself to not turn on his heel and sprint off. Giles just watched the newcomer, curious.
"The king?"
he wondered. Cogsworth nodded, swallowing, looking as though he wished to be much smaller than he was at that moment. A boy approached then, perhaps 10 years old. He ran to the king's side, breathless, despite the grin on his face. In his hand was a bushel of some kind of violet flower with tube-like stems.
"And who is that?"
Giles asked. That is our prince, sir," Cogsworth said quietly. "Prince Alexander." "Papa!" the prince said then. He reached for the king's robes, tugging on them and holding up the plant in his hands. "Look what was growing along the trail! Liminium sicrustium. I read about them in the library, and they're only supposed to grow in—"
"Quiet, boy!"
the king snapped, brushing the child's hand away. The prince fell silent, but not before Giles noticed a flinch shake his small body. The boy had dropped the plant, arms gathering against his chest as he squeezed his eyes shut. No blow had come, but Giles now knew, without a doubt, that one had come before. He narrowed his eyes.
"I accept."
"What?" Cogsworth asked.
"I accept your offer. I will command this guard."
"Ah! The grounds were enough to convince you then? A man of taste," Cogsworth said happily, though Giles sensed his relief. He wondered at the pressure he had been under to find someone to fill the position. The king must have high expectations for his staff. Giles huffed. Well, that king was getting more than what he had bargained for in him. For he had ensured that the prince was never in reach of his father's anger again.
"Ah,"
Giles thought, coming back to the present, the pain in his gut resurfacing.
"Perhaps I sealed my own fate then."
Somehow, he always knew he'd fall while protecting this family. And so he smiled, satisfied, and closed his eyes.
"Agatha!"
Belle held Giles's hand in her own, watching the colour leave his cheeks and his eyes close to unconsciousness. A terrible, sick feeling rose in her throat. She looked up, watching as Adam pressed his crumbled shirt against the open wound, torn moments ago from his chest. It was already soaked through, bright red in the dark halls. He looked up at her, eyes wide and quaking.
He turned away to shout again, Agatha! Belle barely heard him, her shock muting the violence of the battle all around them. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be safe. This wasn't supposed to happen! Agatha arrived only moments after being called. Though to Belle it had seemed like an eternity. You have to help him! Adam cried as she approached, hands now completely coated with Giles's blood. Please! Agatha looked over Giles quickly, then reached out 2 glowing, wrinkled hands and began to work without another word. She closed her eyes, brows furrowing in concentration. Belle watched, her sickness growing at the rate as the pool of blood now soaked her knees. Please! Adam croaked, still pressing his hands against the wound, though it was doing little to stop the flow of blood. Please, Giles! You can't die! He stopped, gritting his teeth hard, eyes growing wet. He closed them quickly, eyes and hands trembling. Oh, God! He gasped. This is all my fault! Belle wanted to tell him it wasn't so, but she suddenly couldn't find her own voice, as she suddenly felt it was her fault too. Several agonizing minutes passed. Then, finally, the stream of blood from Giles's gut began to slow, and soon ceased altogether. What soaked their hands and clothes started to vanish too, dissolving in a faint glow. Will he be all right? Adam asked anxiously. Agatha sucked in a breath, moving her hands towards Giles's heart. She didn't reply, continuing to work. They watched for several more minutes, Belle's vision growing blurry, and she struggled to hold back her tears. Finally, Agatha spoke. I'll need to stay with him for some time, she said slowly. But I believe he'll live. Belle let out a breath, resting a hand to her heart in relief. Across from her, Adam ducked his head, letting out a shaky breath. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you. My prince. Adam looked up. One of Giles's men stood there, panting. Behind him, the battle continued, though it had weakened substantially from before. What would you have us do, your highness? The soldier asked. Adam breathed in deeply, regaining himself and looking up. Can you hold them off? He asked. The man nodded. Agatha has subdued a number of them, but we have sighted both the king's troops and Henry's men attacking on other levels of the palace. Yet it will still take time to subdue them completely, he explained. Take the mademoiselle and return to safety, my lord. We'll manage. Adam looked back at Belle. She frowned. She'll get away, she said. After everything we've worked for. It will be like starting all over again. Adam watched her carefully, then turned back to the soldier at his side. Stay and subdue them, but we'll go on. We end this today. The soldier looked concerned, but only nodded, returning to the fight. Adam scanned the battle himself, still surrounding them on both sides. Then he glanced towards the railing behind them, towards the open space that dropped into the darkness. He looked back at Belle then, growing serious. Do you trust me? He asked. Belle watched him for but a moment. Yes. He nodded sharply and stood, pulling Belle to her feet, and before she knew it, he had swept her into his arms and was barreling towards the balcony ledge. He jumped up at the last moment, feet hitting the top of the railing, and then, pressing Belle close, he leapt into the darkness below. End of part 1. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed this one. Oh boy, dramatic. And, Henry proposed to Sophie. I'm so happy about that. And I like how Chip was comforting Nicolette. Very cute. And I love Giles at the end here. This is amazing. Him stepping in to take the bullet for Belle and Adam. And the flashback when he was going to protect Adam from his own father. Oh my god. Yeah, he and Adam really do have a sort of second father, never had a son sort of bond, don't they? And you guys kind of know that's my weakness by this point if you watch any of my Avengers fics. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment and subscribe and hit that bell to get notified for whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night or whatever time zone you're in. Bye my guys, gals and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.